Antico when they were at Spivey Hall some time ago. So we have some of the faithful here, and others hadn't heard of them yet. Stile Antico, I thought, did a tremendous job. This is an interesting program from a very specific time in musical history, and there were variations on a theme here, and some of it sounded tremendously the same to me, and some of it sounded quite different, but in degrees. You know, there's not too much variation in this program in terms of you know, style. Although, you know, I was interested how all the introductions and so many of the program notes comment on, you know, it depends which monarch is around, and the faith of the monarch has much to do with the music that's made and some of the stylistic choices that result from it when in time. You know, I thought the singers did very well. I kept trying to figure out which of the three Ashby singers were which. I couldn't quite figure that out, but I could find two sisters for sure, and I wasn't so sure about the third. But there were familiar faces in this ensemble, and there were some new ones to me as well. I haven't seen them since they were last at Spivey Hall, but the style of the singing and the way that the group is in a circle and sort of sings to itself, that hasn't changed. They enjoy that way of singing. It helps them hear each other and see each other. And of course, 12 singers is a lot to coordinate, and there's no conductor. So everybody's looking for visual cues and watching, you know, when phrases end and how people breathe to create good ensemble. I will say this, I think the singing is phenomenal. With a group of this size, I think it's unrealistic to expect, you know, German precision beginnings and endings, because it's just too hard to create without. If someone were conducting, there would be a better chance of that. But that's not the history, and that's not the tradition of this music. This music is sung by the singers and led by the singers. So we're hearing it, I think, in that sense, produced in the way that it would have been experienced before. But, you know, we are experiencing it in ways that I'm sure that people never dreamed of, you know, through technology, in instantaneous, you know, transcontinental, you know, experience. So, I mean, you know, go figure. I don't think the English Renaissance had a clue about this, but here we are listening to this glorious music from afar in real time. And I was really glad to hear it. I'm developing a love affair with John Sheppard. And I think there are people on this call who are singers and they have sung Sheppard. But I continue to be drawn to Sheppard. I've heard bits of Sheppard before. I must say that early sacred music is not my field of expertise, so I'm not someone who can proclaim great truths the way, say, Dr. Kurt Zeller would if he were giving a pre-concert talk to this. But I'm so drawn to Sheppard because I think there's an emotional expansiveness to how he writes, and that the way that the lines create expectations and then either realize them or don't realize them. They sort of go off in other ways. There seems to be a very particular type of writing in which the voices, which are all considered independent, interact, which is counterpoint, in ways that create closure and then opening up. And it's the opening up where I find the great pleasure of the Sheppard writing, particularly. I'm curious, have any of you ever sung any of these pieces? Because we've learned from other chats in this Live from London series that some of our viewers have sung these pieces. So, I mean, Bill and Martha have sung some, and Deb and Greg have sung some. So, any comments from the real singers?
If you want to comment, you can also unmute yourself and just, there's not too many of us, so feel free, unmute yourself and go ahead and ask some questions.
I think Bill has an idea here.
Martha's in the other room, so I'll speak for her, but because I've not had the privilege. I think the Gibbons "Oh Clap Your Hands" is just one of the greatest choral pieces. I really enjoy it. But nearing the end, you have the solo treble voice going, God has gone up with a merry noise. And Martha commented that that is the second soprano's star moment, because it is written for second soprano. And that's what Martha's singing right now. It's from a reader, my view is that reading a second soprano line is probably a little more difficult than first. But I guess for polyphonic music, it doesn't make much of a difference anyway. Mm-hmm. But we really enjoyed that particular one.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I also loved, the encore, the final "Never Weather Beaten Sail" by Thomas Campion. That's a moment in where text came shining through in a much simpler texture, musical texture, and that was not always the case in this performance. And there's a lot of reasons for that, I'm sure. But in the Campion piece at the end, which was strophic and more simple and certainly very predictable in how it behaved, it was at the same time I had a certain simplicity and genuine sort of intent to it, and I really enjoyed hearing that. It was a lovely way to end this program. And again, a change of texture to something to relax with and just enjoy the transparency of it.
Anybody else? Okay. Well, I have a few questions coming in. To me, we were talking right before we started this about technology issues, right? But we can also talk about the amazing things that technology have brought us, because now we can experience this music in so many different ways than they could in the 16th century, right? Mm-hmm. So I kind of want to talk about that a little bit. Like what are we getting to listen to that maybe 16th century listeners didn't get to experience?
Wow, that's a very, very big question. Let's put it this way: we in the 21st century have access to music from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and we can sum it up on YouTube, on in our CD collections and our LPs. We can hear just about anything we want to hear that has been recorded, and therefore we have this tremendous abundance of music of every sort that sort of could overcome us if only we were swept away by it. The music of that time, and we've got technology, we've got television. Music is everywhere in our lives, and particularly musical experience through mechanical means is omnipresent. It's online, it's on television, it's on radio. It comes out of your clock in the morning, depending on what clock you have. I mean, it's in elevators, and again, I'm one of these people who can't tune out the internal musical editor. So I'm always figuring out what is this and what is this about and why could this be and should this be better or different? So, I sometimes experience this, but you have to remember that this sacred music was typically sung for liturgical purposes or for ceremonies. And it was not, and the things that have remained that have been documented, particularly from the English Renaissance tradition, have mostly been, not entirely, but have mostly been the bigger, most important ceremonial pieces. Those are the ones that come down to us and that people seem to be drawn to still because of their grandeur. There's also beautiful things that are more intimate. And much of the program today, we were hearing 12 voices at once, sometimes 8, sometimes 5. But basically it was for a significant ensemble of different voices. But I also think it's important to try to remember that if you were one of the very, very fortunate few to be in a cathedral or a church when this music was being sung, how special it would have been and how unusual it would have been, and you would never have heard it before, and you would probably never hear it again unless it were repeated for someone else or some other occasion or some cycle. The whole idea that we can go back and retrieve this music and sort of revisit it is a concept that was totally and not everybody, that we can all quote know it. Musicians were very rare people. Court musicians were extremely rare people and very talented people. And therefore, the idea that this music was easily disseminated is a mistake. It was difficult to disseminate this music. It was carried on in traditions, principally within, you know, religious orders or within, you know, certain monarchies or certain reigns. And therefore, to you know, to hear some of this music is to put this in context, to understand that it was mostly for the glory of God and or the monarch. and that is something that is not as prevalent in our world these days. It's not gone, but it's not as prevalent. This music was written for power, either for the glory of God or for, you know, whoever was in charge of the country, sometimes both. So the idea that we can pull out all these Stile Antico CDs and listen to all this stuff, you know, it's just mind-blowing to me, mind-blowing.
So what do you think most contributes to the rise in popularity in more recent years for this kind of music?
Oh gosh. You know, there are certain groups that made a really big impact in the US in early music. And I'm not going to talk about the earliest of them because early music never disappeared from America. It didn't enjoy the popularity that it does now. I remember very vividly this, and I'm not sure I'm getting the sequence right. I'm just going to explain some impressions I had. Do you remember Le Mystère des Voix Bulgares, the Bulgarian singers that were, you know, the women who were singing Bulgarian folk songs? That sort of took over the music world for a while. And that gave us, you know, a cappella music of a sort of earthy nature and a very distant and quite fascinating. And recorded music took a bump up with this phenomenon. Then there was Anonymous 4, and Anonymous 4 came frequently to Spivey Hall, and they brought back, you know, the idea that there have been American music traditions, vocal traditions that, you know, have been discovered and rediscovered in different ways. And then I will never forget how suddenly this phenomenon of Stile Antico in the United States on public radio was just unprecedented. And perhaps you notice their recordings are made by Harmonia Mundi, but they're out of Harmonia Mundi in the USA. In other words, the USA had such an appetite for this music that the recordings were being decided and essentially produced out of the United States because there was this overwhelming demand for them. And Spivey Hall was not the last to bring Stile Antico to our venue for the first time, but we weren't among the very first. We were still in the throes of this, and I think it's because, and other people should chime in on this, I think it's because in the United States, for the most part, there has been a decline in the general participation in religious services in most areas, not all, but in most areas of the country. Certainly that is true of Europe. And we didn't always have a music in churches that would, there were fights in churches over many years about what music really should be performed. And that's such a huge topic. I shouldn't even mention that topic. We'll never get out of here. But I will observe that Richard, you know, our dear, you know, our dear belated, you know, Richard Morris, our first organist in residence, he was an organist at St. Francis de Sales who had this very, very, very strict view towards music. And the things that Richard would say about contemporary music being performed, yeah, and he was about to be ordained as a priest. You know, the things that Richard would say would make a sailor blush. I mean, he felt so strongly that these deep, you know, centuries-old traditions were the Catholic tradition and nothing else could be countenanced. So there's a lot of passion around this music, but somehow I think that there is somehow the nation was in need of something spiritual that they could listen to, they could consume. I feel that Americans, we have been trained to be some of the best consumers in the world. Our economy is predicated on it. So if we can consume something, then we're doing our jobs as Americans, and we do it extremely well. And therefore, the idea that we could suddenly consume this wonderful spirituality that this earlier sacred vocal music had to us, and the fact that it was based in chant, some of it, and that it had that sort of evocative quality that lets us sort of recede into ourselves at the same time to feel connected to something larger than ourselves. I think we were ready for that as a nation, and therefore we consumed it, and therefore it has grown to such a degree that, you know, Voces8 is there, and Stile Antico is there, and Apollo 5 is there, and there's all these, you know, and that's all the English tradition mostly. But then Chanticleer rose, you know, just before this, and they started with early music too. They started with early music. That was their first footing. They've come on to do other such things like covers of Broadway tunes and a lot of contemporary work. But they made their reputation, and they were first formed to sing music of the 15th and 16th centuries. So I guess I feel that the power of the music continues to speak. And that's the thing I love the most about it, is that we can still appreciate the beauty of this music and the power it has to move us.
Excellent. Well, I have actually a Facebook question from someone that would like to know. They say, this program was referred to as Renaissance polyphony. Could you explain what that means?
Oh boy, yes. Here's an important thing to remember. Polyphony means many voices, and polyphony is, in a musicological sense, is the idea that individual voices have ways of pitch sequences, and that must be followed according to certain choices a composer will make in a certain style, and that the relationship of one voice to the next, from pitch to pitch, also has to be considered. And I think one of the most important things to remember about the music of this period is that how it was conceived. It was conceived vocally, and it was conceived horizontally. In other words, it starts and it moves, all the voices move along from start to finish, and they all have their own life, but their life is greater than the sum of the parts. And how the composers used counterpoint, which is the relationship of one pitch to the other, and how the color of the music and how irregularities in how the sequence of pitches would work, and that has to do with the modes in music. In other words, we have a diatonic scale, you know, and we're so used to that. That diatonic scale is our bread and butter in the 21st century, and that's been around for a long time. But before the diatonic scale, there were modes of singing, and they came from some sacred music traditions. And those modes brought tremendous meaning to the art of counterpoint. So English polyphony means there's this tradition of singing in many voices in ways that the voices have to, each voice has to follow a certain pattern of pitch progression, but the sum total of the voices also take on meaning. And it wasn't until much later, it was until really, let me think, when it's hard, it's, you know, like this is horizontal music. In the diatonic world, we have a lot of vertical music, a C major chord, an F major chord, a G major chord. And that came about late, you know, I would say from about late Baroque and early classical on. That became, when the diatonic scale really became, you know, the foundation of most, quote, new music being written. That's when the whole paradigm changed, because there were still voices. I mean, Mozart wrote the most beautiful melodies, but he was dealing in a harmonic structure. And at the time of the music that you know we heard today, there was no idea of harmony. There was only the relationship of pitches to each other in counterpoint, working horizontally, working sequentially over time. And that's where our ears in the 21st century don't have the benefit of hearing the music the same way that it would have been performed at that time. And Martha has a point.
That's certainly true. Although you have to remember that Tallis wrote the 12 tunes for Archbishop Parker's psalm book. And we still sing some of those. If you sing, "Glory to thee, my God, this night," that's one of Tallis's tunes. And he did build harmony into those. It was 4-part harmony, but people who are really good at analyzing music will point out that what he has actually built in is a kind of polyphony, a kind of counterpoint that is, just like so many things in his life, hidden in plain sight. I would also say that when I moved to Atlanta, one of the things that sort of threw me back on my heels, apart from the fact that I'd never lived in the suburbs anywhere, was that that where I had come from, spent 11 years in Toronto, where choral music was considered a preferred form of music in itself. It wasn't what you do if you're not good enough to be a soloist and sing at the Met. You know, choral music was itself an art form.
Its own calling, yes.
And it was an art form that you specialized in. And I sang in a lot of choirs. And so I went looking for a choir when I got here, and I did find this, you know, oh yeah, well, I'm just here until I can get into the, you know, opera chorus or something, or yeah, but I'm taking voice lessons and I've got all these auditions and so on. You know, I want to be a soloist, not just a secondary musical citizen singing in a choir. And the other thing is that there was very little polyphonic music, and I was used to singing a lot of it. And outside the US, I would say, except for maybe some churches in the US.
Minnesota, maybe.
Well, but did St. Olaf's sing polyphonic music? I don't know. But
in St. Paul, maybe, yes.
Yeah. And in England, you can trace the rise of what we see now really back to the early 20th century and the Oxford movement, which restored the Anglo-Catholic ritual to the Anglican churches. And with it, there was a whole wave of people writing music in the polyphonic style. So you get the Stanford motets, you get some Vaughan Williams, and in France you get Duruflé and Poulenc. And then, so that was already there. And one of the churches I sang at was Healy Williams Church. He was long dead quite long dead by the time I sang there, but nonetheless, the tradition continued, and we sang a lot of polyphonic music, including Latin motets. And I sang in the Trinity College Chapel Choir, and there again, we sang a variety of things, but a lot of polyphonic music, a lot of a cappella, a lot of Latin motets. And when I think of the popularization, I think you also have to recognize the real importance of the King's Singers, who presented to a much wider secular audience this same kind of music, and also did it because they were one voice to a part. They did it in a way that was more likely to replicate what it happened originally. I suspect some of this was very badly sung in its early days. You know, it was.
That's just it. Yeah. Also, may I interrupt? You know, singing these 12 singers, they're all so healthy and good looking, and they've got all their teeth. You know, they've got beautiful hair, and it's like, oh no, no, that would not have been true in the 1600s. No,
and also they can come from all over England, and I think that's also something that we have today. You know, even the greatest musicians, they might have heard rumors of what was going on at San Marco in Vienna, and the fact that they could have the triple choir effect around the church, but very few of them got to Venice to hear it. And the music, well, it had to be hand copied, right? A lot of it, and that's how you got it. Now, something to remember about Elizabeth is that along with opening no windows into men's souls, she also believed in opening people's pocketbooks, and she gave the monopoly on printing music to two recusant Catholics, Byrd and Tallis. They had the monopoly on publishing music in their lifetime.
I did not know that.
Yes, so
fascinating.
so that's, you know, she recognized talent, shall we say.
They were the Rupert Murdochs of their time in music.
They were, they absolutely were.
Well, we actually have a follow-up question from Facebook. So is this the same style as chanting monks use?
Oh, it's much more evolved from that. I think chanting monks are an even earlier music, and exclusively sacred.
Perfect. Well, the last question that we want to ask is about lyrics, basically, right? So how important is it to even understand or to be able to understand the words that are being sung in this early sacred music?
Another big question. And I'm sure others will have opinions on this too. I'm going to draw a comparison, but first I'm going to say that when a composer sits down to write music, the music, particularly if it's to be sung and there are to be words, the words probably have to serve a purpose in some way. So the choice of what words will be sung in what language has a lot to do with what the composer will seek an inspiration for the musical composition. So, you know, the question is who gets to choose the words? Many times in you know, for a specific purpose, I mean, you know, this is later, but think of Bach and, you know, churning out a lot of music for the liturgical calendar to go through the year to make sure that he was always creating cantatas that had relevance to that time of year. It's not exactly the same in this period, but the idea that there were certain things that need to be sung at certain times had a lot to do with, you know, the religious calendar. And I've asked myself, you know, would any of these monarchs have really understood the Latin that they were, you know, hearing? And I don't know that anybody can ever answer that question, but you can be sure that the people around the monarchs were very concerned of making sure that what was being sung was proper, because there was no lack of supervision and no lack of competition for righteousness in these circles. So, you know, there were things that were deemed correct and necessary. So these things that were deemed correct and necessary were probably, we need this text, and therefore will you please compose to this text. So one of the things that I can't say that drove me crazy about this program, and this is not just about this program. This is I've experienced this online and in listening to various CDs of Stile Antico. This group favors sound over diction. They just do. Let's say you printed out all of the words to all of these compositions that we heard today. I find it very difficult to know when they're entering on any particular word. But why is that? Because 12 voices of 12 healthy, independent voices create a lot of sound. And therefore, the sound is the glory. The sound is the inspiration. The sound is what moves people. And therefore, I think, unlike, say, in the Lieder tradition, much later, or even in the madrigal tradition, the Italian madrigal tradition, also later, that, you know, where text painting was so important, and the idea of making sure that the words, you know, prima la musica e poi le parole, or the other way around, you know, which comes first, music or words or music? In this period, with this music, I think the preeminence of sound had to do with the fact that they were singing in cathedrals and in large spaces, and therefore the sound would bloom. There was no way that that could be changed, and I think they decided to capitalize on it. And therefore, that's where what we can expect of Stile Antico is to enjoy a tremendous, we can just, you know, luxuriate in the sound. That's certainly true of Tenebrae. I mean, Tenebrae has diction. Oh, but that sound, they go for sound big time. So maybe Fred has a question here too.
Well, just to comment on along that line of the sound, because I didn't have any particular problem following, you know, finding where they were in the text. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it, I'm sure, had to do with the way they were spread out in that space, because one of the things I remember from the concert in Spivey Hall was how perfect the diction came through. And one of my first thoughts as they started singing was, I would like to have heard them in King's Place last week, because it's a slightly drier, and they were so spread out, so far out into that hall that the sound just went, whoa. And when they did that, was Byrd the quartet?
There's a piece
when the four singers at the back, that was just
the Tallis. The Tallis
wonderful, and there was no problem understanding the English in that final piece.
Oh yeah. That was. I agree. The diction there was clear, but it also the musical setting enabled that. There weren't as many voices competing for our attention, but also not as many. There wasn't the polyphonic temptation of being luxuriated, by all these things happening at once. I mean, it's if you give yourself over to it, it's just ecstatically beautiful.
And I'd also go back to your comments about John Sheppard early on, and how his name was completely new to us last week when the 16 sang that.
When they sang some Sheppard, yes,
I think, and it just stood out as being. We almost thought it was 20th century because it was so spare, and it had a kind of a much more common practice, or almost common practice harmony to it, which was true of the Lord's Prayer today. Having the explanation about why he had to do that during
a certain reign.
Mary's reign had to. Oh no, had to do it during Edward because it was suddenly Protestant, and there was none of this. None of this Renaissance frill.
I mean, music has never. Oh, I have to watch this. Music is not invulnerable from trends of fashion. Let's put it that way. So I think finding favor among powerful people involves sometimes some very careful choices of taste. And here's Bill with an idea.
Your remarks on the diction. In a certain sense, the people who counted already knew the words, because like the Tudor monarchs were fluent in Latin,
all of them.
and they were also had religious education. So if the piece was called in Ye Unio ec fletu, they knew exactly where that came from and what it meant. They could probably speak it from memory. So I wouldn't be surprised if for them, especially in the large churches, like in and also in the Chapel Royal, the diction really didn't matter. They already kind of knew it, and so what they really wanted was the sound. And I think that really comes through in the Sheppard. Except during Edward's reign, because that Catholic Mass was just so huge anyway.
Well, and besides, the Catholic Mass always had the same words, right? The Catholic
there was a very defined Catholic Mass.
Yes, and also very often the texts, like the graduals and so on, would reflect something that was already read. Now, it would also be read in Latin, but church then was very contemplative before the Reformation. And so people didn't necessarily want to hear all the words or need to. They wanted to have the experience and the visual experience and see the incense coming up. And then they had a whole set of individual prayers and meditations that they did during the Mass. Right. So this sort of added to it. But I will say, I thought it was very clever of them to sing Factum est Silentium, because that is a motet for Michaelmas, dum committeret bellum Draco Michaeli et Angelus, right? That's Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and Michaelmas is on Tuesday. So they're singing that motet right about the time it would have been sung in church.
Again, time, temporal considerations, and power considerations.
And even
Right.
in sacred music, you know, it was important to have a patron. These composers to have a patron. If they weren't getting paid, then they couldn't live and produce the music. So that
Mhm.
influences the style and what they decide to sing about as well.
Mhm. Yes, and I have no history. I have no knowledge of how these individual composers got chosen, or whose taste was at work, or how someone was found to be more pleasing or more correct. But that's that nature, that human nature probably hasn't changed too much.
Well, I would love, I know it's a little bit after 4 today, but I would love to hear what everyone's favorite pieces from today were. Anybody want to share your favorites from today's performance?
I think my favorite was the Sheppard, because I think it really showed off the sopranos and the acoustic of the hall.
Oh, Coleman, which of the Shepherds? The Gaude Maria? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The last one.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've seen them live many times, but the venue makes so much difference in your enjoyment of it. I've seen them at the Boston and Utrecht festivals, and many times in London and other places in the States. But the best was definitely Spivey Hall and the Temple Church in London.
Oh wow!
I saw them once at the Duke Chapel in Durham. It was like acoustically dead. It was a beautiful place, but they were just totally lost in that place.
Thinking of memories, I'll remember freezing my ass off in a church in Santa Barbara trying to get through a performance by the Tallis Scholars. I have never been so cold in that church, and it sort of traumatized me. I could barely go back to Tallis Scholars for years. It took me a long time to warm up after that experience. But yes, we have our impressions of artists in certain spaces, and the space that Stile Antico sang in today is not that much larger than what you see. In other words, it's not a real concert hall. It's more like a vestibule, quite frankly. And if the cameras would do a 360 of that space, you would see that there's just enough room for production personnel by a door that is sort of to our backs as we watch. It's not a large space, and there's not a great opportunity for seating at all. It's actually just a very reverberant part of an old Wren church. So that would happen to be available and suited the purposes of Voces8. So Voces8, excuse me. So yeah, space matters, context matters for this music, I think. Yeah, I so enjoyed it. I was interested. I know others had looked forward to the Gaude Maria as well, and this was my first experience with it. And I did like the way that the chant came in at the end, the ahs, and sort of slowing down how the piece winded up. I thought that was really beautiful. I'll also say this, in the sound that we were hearing today, I thought the definition and the intonation of the men's voices was superb. They were just, if they singing in unison, they were really together, and it just made so much, it just lets you hear into the textures so much. Particularly in a rich texture, having really good intonation helps that so much.
Well, Sam, thank you so much. I love to hear you talk about music.
Oh, Fred has a, what was your favorite, Fred?
This is just slightly off topic as we seem to be wrapping up. And thinking back to our Wigmore series earlier this summer, I wanted to if people aren't paying attention, Angela Hewitt is doing her Art of the Fugue Monday night live from Wigmore, and we missed her. Well, we didn't miss the last week recital, which was a repeat of what she played for us. She did that at the same time as the 16, and we listened to that on Sunday night, and it was spectacular.
Now, Angela's moving forward, and I'm sure that she will be performing often at Wigmore because she's a huge draw there, and of course she's immensely popular. I just got a text from Michael Koch yesterday saying, "Oh, Angela's newest release is Beethoven Variations," and I thought, "Oh, that would be interesting." Angela's almost done with her complete Beethoven cycle. Yeah, she's steadily been recording Beethoven sonatas, and Hammerklavier was one of the last, ones that she needed to conquer, and she has conquered it. She played a little bit of it for us in lockdown when she was doing these, brief daily recitals from her home, and we heard a movement of her clavier then. Yeah. So any other parting thoughts? Oh, we have a question. The initial Live from London series was announced as 10 performances. They've added a new one, and it's coming up in October, and it's the English Chamber Orchestra. And for those of you who lingered a little bit today, you got a little promo for that. There was an English Chamber Orchestra playing in
October 7th.
I think, yeah, and I think that where they were playing, I think that's Cadogan Hall, in London. And the cellist, who I think is the English Chamber Orchestra, is an unusual group. It's sort of self-led. It's had some marvelous conductors over the years, but it's also a very feisty group of musicians. And I think that cellist is one of the co-leaders of the English Chamber Orchestra right now. But the program they're performing is a tribute to Raymond Leppard. And Raymond Leppard is a conductor I did not know very well, but I worked with often, both in Minnesota and in St. Louis and in Australia. And he was one of their, favorite conductors for a long time. So they've got this tribute program to him that includes 2 really wonderful British vocalists and a young conductor who came out of singing in opera repetiteur work. And I've only seen him conduct once on YouTube, and I'll just, forgive me, I was not terribly impressed. But the program is interesting, and it also includes The Lark Ascending, I think, of Vaughan Williams, which is such a beautiful piece. So we were curious about how, and this is on a Wednesday of all days. It's not on a weekend, it's on a Wednesday. And we were curious about how many people thought that might be something we should also do a post-stream talk about, because it's different. And I see several hands, and yeah. Okay, so, Wednesday nights are, I forget, it's a Wednesday morning. It's like at 10 o'clock on Wednesday, I think. Didn't we figure that out, Tammy? It's 10 o'clock on Wednesday, because it's 3 o'clock their time.
Which is better than the 7 a.m. live from London, so.
Well, it was only actually 8. It was 7 for us. It was 8 for the rest of the world, for people watching. So, yeah, I had to wake up at 6 to have 2 cups of coffee to be cogent, to be in the car going to Spivey Hall at 7:30 to do something at 8. I'm just that way. I'm better at 2 a.m. than I am at 6 a.m. So, yeah, so we might spend part of our Wednesday doing that. And if so, then we'll certainly send around the news of it. And it's an interesting program. It includes Raymond Leppard's own arrangement of, I think, God Save the Queen, of all things. Who knows? I hope the conductor is better than he was on this first U2 experience. That's my greatest hope for this program right now. But the rest of the music should be very good. And the players have plenty of conviction. This is a group that made an entire series of Mozart concerti with both, I think with 3. Murray Pariah did an entire Mozart concerto cycle with them. Mitsuko Uchida did as well, with Jeffrey Tate. And then Daniel Barenboim did quite a number of performances and recordings with English Chamber Orchestra. Of course, the musicians have all changed since then. But these ensembles don't change overnight. There's some tradition that is maintained in sort of the group think and the zeitgeist of what how they make music. So, I just, for repertoire, if nothing else, I think, and the singers are really good. There's a mezzo and a soprano, and I listen to those very happily. People who like singing will like hearing these ladies.
that October 7th date is an embarrassment of riches, because we'll be able to watch ECO in the morning and then tune into Wigmore at 3:30 or 2:30 for the Eben Quartet doing Beethoven Opus 130, 131, and 131, 132.
Wow.
Well, they're doing the last three plus the Grosse Fugue.
My gosh, they are going to have multiple bowls of Wheaties that morning. That's outrageous. That's outrageous. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. Oy, oy, oy. Oh well. No lives will be harmed in the making of that music, but I still wonder about it. All right. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Elise. Thank you, Tammy. Thank you, friends. We love having you in front of us virtually, and the opportunity to talk with you is such a pleasure. So thanks again, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.
One question.
Oh, another question. Yes, sir.
For Elise.
Oh.
For Elise, who's your
Yes.
handsome friend there?
Oh, this is Winston.
Oh, okay.
I shut him out of the room, but my 5-year-old likes to open all the doors, so he wandered.
Winston, that's great.
And he's very sweet.
He's very he's sleeping.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to you as well. We
Pleasure.
love to get your feedback every time about anything that we can. So thanks for joining us. Thanks for being here. Thank you to all of our friends. We look forward to seeing you again, and have a wonderful rest of your Saturday.
Thank you.
Thanks,
You
everyone.
too.
See you next week.
Bye.
So,
Bye.